So welcome back. We'll be resuming from where we'd stopped in the last session. Just before we start, I'd like to recap what we've covered so far. Uh, we have discussed in the last session what a market was and how it was a place where people come to trade stuff, and this is where buyers and sellers meet, and there is an exchange that happens over there. We've discussed very briefly about what a monopoly is and what a case of perfect competition was. And then we went on to discuss different types of goods. We talked about inferior goods, normal goods, substitutes, complements. We talked about luxury goods. Then we went on to talk about the demand curve and how the demand curve represents the behavior of the household, and how this particular demand curve tells you the willingness and the ability of a particular person to actually buy a certain level of goods at a certain price level. Then we talked about different factors that determine or impact the demand for a particular good. And when we were talking about this, we discussed how factors like your income, your tastes and preferences, your expectation about the future, the number of buyers all impact the demand for goods in the market. And we talked about how there is a difference between quantity demanded and the demand of the good. And we talked about how changes in price levels cause a shift along the demand curve, which is a change in quantity demanded, whereas a change in demand happens when one of these factors, income, expectations, and other factors change, causing a change in the demand. And then we talked about how inferior goods were goods, the demand for which would decrease if your income increased, whereas for a normal good, the demand should increase if your income increases. We talked about how substitutes are similar products that can be substituted if the price of one product goes up, you shift to the other one. Whereas complements were those two goods that had to be used together, and if the price of one good went up and its demand fell, what would happen is the demand for the complement would also fall. In this session, we'll be talking about the supply side of things now. We'll be discussing how the supply curve is derived using the supply schedule. We'll be talking about determinants of supply and what causes a shift in the supply curve. We'll be talking about what an equilibrium is. Equilibrium is, to give you a heads up, it's where the quantity demanded of goods becomes equal to the quantity supplied and the market clears. And at this equilibrium point, a certain price is set, and this price setting mechanism is basically what Adam Smith called the invisible hand at work in determining prices. From here onwards, we'll start off with the supply curve and keep on discussing how it's determined, what affects them, what causes movement along the curve, what causes a shift in the curve, and what are factors that we need to understand so that we can understand why prices change in the market when they have to. One other thing that we haven't discussed in the last session is regarding market demand and market supply. So what we need to understand is that in the last session when we were discussing demand, we were talking about an individual's demand, and when we talk about every individual's demand added together, you come up with what's called the market demand, and the market demand is very similar to the individual's demand. So that's why we don't have to fuss too much about it at the moment. So let's just start with the supply side of things, and hopefully halfway through the session I'll have a quiz ready for you that I want you guys to go through. It's going to help me assess how much of this video is helping you with your understanding. Right, so we'll start off with the supply side now. Uh, but before we start off with the supply side, we need to understand that when we were talking about demand, we were talking about the household and how we were studying the household's behavior and figuring out how uh, the household would be demanding stuff. Now we're going to be talking about the firms or the sellers, and we'll try to figure out how they decide on the amount of quantity to produce and sell. And that is how we'll come up with the supply curve. Recall from last time that we talked about the supply law, which basically said that if the price of a good goes up, the quantity supplied would go up as well, assuming everything else remains constant. Using that logic and using the fact that most sellers are here to make profit, we'll be deriving a supply schedule, and from there we'll come up with a supply curve. So recall that last time when we were discussing the demand curve, we discussed the demand schedule in which we had prices and quantity demanded. But then, since we're talking about supply now, we'll have supply over here. Last time we talked about the demand for chocolate bars. So we'll continue on with this example and assume that we're talking about the supply of chocolate bars over here. If the price at which the seller sells the chocolate bars is zero, he will have no incentive to actually produce chocolate bars, and since he'll not be getting any money, so he won't supply any amount of chocolate bars, so the quantity supplied in the market would be zero. If his bars start selling for 10 rupees, he might end up wanting to supply, say, 5 bars. If the price increases to 20 rupees per bar, he might want to increase his production and supply more bars because he sees additional revenue from making these bars. Since his fixed costs are not changing, but we'll discuss costs later or later on. But uh, if you've understood how we've come up with this decision or the supply schedule, we now move on to plot this on a graph. This graph is going to be very similar to the demand curves graph. We'll have prices on the y-axis and quantity supplied rather than quantity demanded on the x-axis. And then we'll go on to plot these data points on the graph. And you'll find that 0, 0 should be over here somewhere. So let's just 10, 20, 10, 20. So the first one is 0, 0. The second one is 10 and 5. They should be over here somewhere. And the second one is 20 and 10. So it should be over here somewhere. And if you connect these together, you come up with an individual seller's supply curve. So this becomes the supply curve. What I want everyone to remember is that this is an individual seller's supply curve. This is one person deciding on how much chocolate he's willing to supply at what price levels. Since there are many sellers in the market, if you add the if you keep on adding uh, the quantity supplied at each price level for all the sellers, you'd come up with a different value, a larger value of quantity supplied, and this larger value of quantity supplied would be called the market supply. So, just to help you understand this, suppose this is person one's quantity supplied, then you go to another supplier who says that at 0 he'll be supplying 0, but at price 10 he's willing to supply 10 bars, and then at 20 he's willing to supply 20 bars. If you keep on adding different suppliers quantity supplied, you come up with something called the market supply. Individual supplies get added together to formulate the market supply. Once we now that we've derived the supply curve, we'll be discussing what causes movements along the supply curve and what causes shifts in the supply curve in the next video. So now that we've finally come up with the supply curve, just like the demand curve, we need to understand the supply curve is one seller's supply curve. And if you sum up everyone's supply curve, also the supply curves of all of the suppliers, you come up with what's called the market supply. So you have an individual supply, which is one seller's supply curve, and since there are many sellers in the market, if you add all of their supplies together, you come up with what's called the market supply. It's an aggregate of all the individual supplies. Just this, it's so basically it's the same as the case of the demand. So just to so now that we've come up, um, so now that we've come up with the supply curve, uh, we need to remember that this is an individual supply curve that we've just derived. And if you, since there are many people, many sellers in the market, if you add everyone's supply curves together, you come up with what's called the market supply curve. The slide is going to probably show you this. Now that we've talked about how the fact that the supply curve is an upward sloping curve, and it's depicting the supply law, which says that when the price of a good goes up, the quantity supplied in the market goes up as well. We want to figure out what are the factors that impact uh, the supply curve or the market supply. What causes this market supply to shift left or right? And similar to the case that we've talked about in reference to the demand side of the model, we want to talk about factors that affect the supply curve. These factors include input prices, technology, expectations, and number of buyers. Uh, Similar to the previous case, you need to be able to mentally interpret what happens to the supply curve once if one of these factors changes. So what we'll do is we'll make a supply curve over here and try to figure out what happens to the supply curve one by one. So we have an upward sloping supply curve. First case that we want to discuss is what happens to the supply curve if input prices goes up. So the ingredients that are used to make the chocolate bars, or the labor that's used to make the chocolate bars, or other factors that are basically inputs into the production of those chocolate bars. If the price goes up, what happens? We need to understand that at the beginning of this course, we talked about something related to resource constraints and the fact that resources are limited, and economics was something about how to optimally use them. And so in this case, let's just assume that the sellers have limited resources. If the input prices go up, this means that they would obviously be able to supply a fewer amount of goods with their given resources. And if that's the case, this curve would shift towards the left. And you'd have a new supply curve since input prices have gone up. If input prices fall, it would be vice versa. I'm not going to go and show you this on the graph. What happens? So now let's go on to the second case regarding technology. What happens if there is an improvement in technology? So in case of an improvement in technology, the firm that was probably making these chocolate bars might be able to, with the better technology now, they might be able to produce more bars with the given resources that they have. So we should expect that the supply curve to shift towards the right. And now you'd have a new supply curve, because better technology means faster production or cheaper production, or one of these cases. The third factor that we want to discuss now is expectations. When it comes to expectations, let's suppose that the firm expects that the prices of this product, the Mars bar, is going to go up in the future. If that's the case, you will normally find that this behavior of stockpiling would happen. The firms would just want to hold on to their goods and not supply the amount needed in the market and hoard these goods. eventually what would happen is they would be holding on to these goods and not supplying them in the market, and when prices rise they would supply the goods in the market and make more profit out of it. So in the case of an expectation of higher prices in the future, you should expect that the supply curve should move in the leftward direction, meaning showing you a decrease in the total supply of chocolates in the market, because they expect that in the future the prices are going to increase and they can sell these chocolates later on at a higher price. The last one is number of sellers. This should be self-explanatory. If you have more sellers in the market, the individual supplies added up together form the market supply, and if you have more individual sellers in the market, the total supply in the market would go up, and this supply curve should move in the rightward direction. So you'd have a new supply curve. So this is it about what causes the shift in the supply curve. The last thing that we want to talk about over here is what causes movement along the supply curve. If you recall, in the case of the demand curve, we said that only events that cause changes in the prices of the goods should cause movement along the supply curve or the demand curve. It's the same with supply and demand. Any changes in prices should cause movement along the curve. And once you move along the curve, this movement along the curve, it results in a change in quantity supplied rather than a change in supply. So just to recap, so far we've discussed what a market is, and we've discussed two cases of uh, monopoly and perfect competition. We've talked about uh, how we want to figure out the behavior of buyers and sellers in this particular model that we were discussing over here. And we've talked about how when we discuss the behavior of buyers, we'll be discussing the demand curve, and when we'll discuss the behavior of sellers, we'll be discussing the supply curve. Uh, we've also discussed two laws till this point, the demand law and the supply law. Both of these laws have an implication in reference to the relationship between price and quantity. The demand law basically says that keeping everything else constant, the demand quantity demanded goes up if prices fall. Similarly, the supply law says that assuming everything else constant, an increase in price will result in quantity supplied being going up, assuming everything else is constant. Uh, we have used the demand and supply schedule to come up with these demand and supply curves. We've discussed different types of goods. We've discussed inferior goods, normal goods. We've discussed luxury goods or giffen goods. We've discussed complements and substitutes. And we've discussed how different factors that determine demand and supply can impact the demand and supply of goods in the market. And we've talked about how individual demands of people can be summed up together to give you the market demand, and we've talked about how individual supply decisions of individual sellers can be summed up to give you the market supply of a particular good in an economy. Now that we've discussed these two agents and their behavior differently, we'll be bringing these behaviors together, and this is where you'll be able to figure out how the market behaves. Recall the market was a place where these buyers and sellers would meet and exchange would happen. Recall also that the demand curve was showing you the behavior of the households, and the supply curve was showing you the behavior of the firms that were supplying goods in the market. So this particular model, the demand supply model, is a model that's showing you how the market works. and how individual or market behavior is determined by how households and firms react to different conditions or different factors of the economy. So, recall we've discussed the demand curve and we said it's a downward sloping curve, which is um, not the case for the exception over here, which is uh, the given good exception. Please remember that. And then we talked about the supply curve as well, and we discussed how it's an upward sloping curve. But before we go to that, I just want to recap what we know about the demand curve. Any movement along the demand curve is caused by a change in a factor that causes a change in price of goods. If the price of the particular good changes, you move along the curve, quantity demanded changes. If there is a change in income, there is a change in preferences, there is a change in expectation about the future, there is a change in taste, there is a change in price of your substitutes or complements, it should cause the demand curve to shift either left or right depending on what happens. Now, since we have price on the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis, you can add quantity supplied on the x-axis, x-axis over here again, and now you have price and quantity supplied on the x-axis, and you can come up with the supply curve over here as well. I'll draw it in red. So we have the supply curve over here in red. Now, this whole picture or the graph that you see over here formulates or completes everything that you need to know regarding the demand and supply model. Uh, what the demand and supply model is going to be helping us in doing is it's going to help us to determine how much of a quantity of goods and services are going to be produced in a particular market. So, how many chocolate bars are actually going to be produced in in this particular market, and how many uh, chocolate chocolate bars are going to be supplied in the market. So, and at what price? So, this model is going to be talking about how much of a particular good, in this case, chocolate bars, are going to be produced and supplied into the market, and what is their price going to be. Recall that when we were discussing only demand at a certain price level, let's say 10 over here, there was a certain amount of quantity demanded. At a different price level, say 8, since the price had gone down, people started to demand more. The quantity demanded increases. At price level 10, the quantity demanded is, let's suppose, 5 over here. But at price level 10, you need to understand that the quantity that the seller is willing to supply is at price level 10, the supplier says, I'm willing to supply you this amount of things in the market. So he's willing to supply you 10 chocolate bars in the market, but price level 10 is really high for the consumers. So they say at price level 10, I will only be, or the market says we'll be only requiring 10 markets. So the demand in the market is going to be 10 chocolates. However, since the price is so high, the seller is happy about it because he can make more profit out of it and he's willing to supply 10 bars over here. Now, what happens is since the demand is only for 5 bars, people only want 5 bars, and the seller is willing to supply you 10 bars. What happens in the market is there is an excess. The supplier makes and supplies 10 bars, people only wanted to buy 5 of them. What happens is these 5 bars get sold, but 5 of them are left. So there is an excess of chocolate bars in the economy. Since these extra 5 bars, nobody wanted them because the price was too high, they were made but not sold. So we say that there is a surplus in the market. These 5 bars are a surplus. And in order to sell these extra surplus 5 bars, the prices has to fall. Because you need to understand that if the price had been, say, 8 rupees, the demand for bars would have been maybe 7 bars. But you also need to understand that at 8 rupees, the supplier would have only been willing to supply you with 9 bars. So there would have been a shortfall of, or a surplus of 2 bars over here in this case. There would have been a surplus of 2 bars over here in this case. But if the price had been 7 rupees, what would have happened is, I'm on the blue line over here, on this blue demand line. The demand for chocolate bars would be 8, and at this point, this crossing over here at price level 7, the supplier would be only willing to supply you with 8 bars. So the supplier would say, I'm only willing to supply you with 8 bars over here. So at this point, what would be happening is that that people would be asking for 7 bars, and the suppliers would be the people would be asking for 8 bars of chocolate, and the supplier would be selling you 8 bars of chocolate. And what would happen is the market would clear. All of the chocolates that are made in the market would get sold. This particular point over here, where the demand of goods equals the supply of goods, is called the equilibrium point. So this point over here where the demand and supply curve cut, it's called the equilibrium point. At the equilibrium point, the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So 8 bars were demanded, 8 bars are supplied, the market clears, no bar is left unsold, everybody's happy. Note what's happened. If the price in the market would have been 10 rupees, there would have been an excess of 5 bars. So the seller would automatically say that, hey, I don't want to be creating an excess of, or creating a surplus in the market where my goods aren't being sold. The market would force the seller to start reducing its price. The price would start falling until the price comes down to 7. And when the price is down at 7, none of the seller's uh, product is going to be left unsold. So this is where when we discuss Adam Smith and his invisible hand, this is the invisible hand at work. What the invisible hand is doing is it's determining the price in the market based on the demand curve and the supply curve. So both the demand and supply is determining that the price of the Mars bar in this market is going to be 7 rupees. What if somehow the price in the market was less than 7 rupees? So what if we had a case over here where you had the demand curve and you had the supply curve at prices over here and quantity demanded and supplied over here? What if the price in the market gets set at, say, 3 rupees? Recall we've just concluded that the price in the market should be 7 rupees. So at 7 rupees, there should be equilibrium. All goods, at 7 price, 7 would be produced and 7 would get sold. What if, because of some reason, the market sets a price of 3 over here? At price level 3, what's happening is that quantity demanded in the market is, let's say, 9. However, the price is so low that the supplier is like, uh, it doesn't make sense for me to make a lot of this product. I'll only be making how much? The supplier would only be willing to supply the market with, let's say, 6 bars. So what would happen is the supplier is only willing to supply you with 6 bars, and 9 people actually are willing and able to buy these chocolate bars. So there are a lot of people who want the bar, but only 6 are being made. 3 extra people want it, but only 6 are being supplied by the supplier. The supplier is only supplying you with 6 bars, whereas the market at price level 3 is demanding 9 bars. So there is a shortage in the market. So this is a shortage. When there is a shortage in the market, what happens is that there, the market forces the prices to go up, because now one person out of these 3 people who didn't get the bar might say that, hey, I'm willing to buy the chocolate from you for 4 rupees. Another one might say for 5. Another one might say 6. But at 7 rupees, only 7 people will be demanding the chocolate, whereas the supplier is only going to be able to supply you with 7 of the chocolates, and this is where equilibrium will happen again. So the point where the demand equals the supply is called the equilibrium point, and that is where the demand and supply curves are actually cutting. Till this point, we've talked about how market force causes the price to go up or go down, and this increase or decrease in price is the market at work, and it's an invisible force that's determining the prices in the market. So now that we've talked about shortages and surpluses and discussed how these shortages and surpluses are actually the force behind how prices are determined in markets, we want to go a little further and discuss how different factors affect the market and the price determined by the market. But before we do that, let's just recap what we have covered so far. So, just to recap, so far we've talked about the demand and supply curves, and we've talked about how an equilibrium is a position is a condition where the quantity demanded in the market becomes equal to the quantity supplied. That's this blue dot over here where these two curves intersect. This is the point where quantity demanded becomes equal to quantity supplied, and this is where the market clears. There is no unsold item left in the market. And at this point, there is a certain price that determines this point, and that point is called the equilibrium price. So I'm calling it P star over here. This is the equilibrium price. And at this equilibrium price, your quantity demanded is equal to your quantity supplied, and this, whatever the value of the quantity is, it's called the equilibrium quantity. So we'll call it Q star over here. So we talked about how buyers have create a demand for stuff, sellers create the supply for stuff, and at different prices, both the sellers and the people demand and supply are willing and able to demand and supply different quantities of goods. There is one price at which the quantity demanded by the buyers becomes equal to the quantity supplied by the sellers, and this point is called the equilibrium point. And at the equilibrium point, the price of the good is called the equilibrium price, and the quantity being supplied in the market and demanded in the market is called the equilibrium quantity. Now that we've discussed this, here is where all of those shifts in the curves that we've discussed previously come into play. Um, so, just to recap, uh, different factors that cause shifts in the supply curve include technology, number of sellers, um, input costs, and expectations about prices in the future. Right? So recall that although in this particular graph over here, what I've done is I've come up with a particular equilibrium price. This is where the market is going to determine the price. The price that is to be determined by the market in this case is P star over here. But if, for example, um, input costs go up, for example, since we're talking about bars of chocolate over here, if the price of sugar goes up, and we know that sellers have um, a resource constraint, this means that they'll be able to supply a lesser amount of goods in the market. If that's the case, what do you think should happen to the supply curve? Input costs have gone up, they'll be able to supply less. If they're able to supply less, what should happen is the supply curve should move outwards. Now, what's the consequence? The consequence of the supply curve moving to the left is that the equilibrium point, which was this blue dot over here, let's call it A over here, now it's changed from A to a new point, and the new equilibrium point over here is point B. And at point B, what's happening is the prices have gone up. You have a new equilibrium point and a new equilibrium quantity over here in a different color. So that's one case. What happens when input costs change? If things become cheaper, what do you think should happen? If the input costs fall, what should happen is with the given resources, the suppliers and sellers should be able to supply more in the market. Them supplying more in the market should cause the supply curve to move towards the right. And when the supply curve moves to the right, we have a new equilibrium point over here, which is, let's call it B over here. And at this equilibrium point, at the new equilibrium point, prices are lower, but the total amount of quantity of goods being supplied in the economy has gone up. So what we'll do now is we'll discuss a couple of cases about what happens in the market when this happens and what happens in the market when this happens. All of them have to be related with the previous class that we had, in which we discussed the determinants of demand, and this class in which we determined factors that impact supply. All of these factors that we'll be discussing next are going to be somehow connecting those factors with a movement in one of these curves, causing a change in the equilibrium, resulting in a change in price levels in the market and quantity supplied in the market. So now let's just go on to the slides for a minute. Um, so I'll go through the slides uh, from the equilibrium part onwards. Um, so we were talking about equilibrium just now. Um, so recall that when you combine both supply and demand curves together, there is a point where the demand curve intersects the supply curve, and this point is called the equilibrium point. This is a situation where the price levels have reached a level where the quantity supplied has become equal to the quantity demanded. This is where the market is clearing. And this slide just shows you some definitions about equilibrium price and equilibrium quantities. We've already discussed this. You can also use the demand schedule to actually figure out what the equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity would be. Note that on the demand schedule and the supply schedule, in this case, where they're talking about ice cream cones, uh, at one price and one price alone, the quantity demanded in the demand schedule is equal to the quantity supplied in the supply schedule. That's price level $2. At $2, the market demand is for 7 ice creams, whereas the market supply is 7 ice creams. That's where the market has come to an equilibrium point at price level $2. So, so if the price had been higher or lower, the market would have forced the price to change and become $2. And at $2, the market would have cleared and all of the goods would have been sold. So this is the graphical depiction. In this case, if the price had been higher than $2, it would have created a surplus in the market. The demand would have been less, the supply would be more, and eventually what would have happened is that the supply would have to decrease prices in order to sell its excess amount of goods. So here's that case. If the price was $2.50, what would have happened is the seller would have been willing to supply you 10 of these ice creams, but the demand in the market would be for 4 ice creams only, and there would be an excess of 6. And this excess would force the supplier to reduce his prices. When the price would fall, the demand for goods would also increase, and eventually you'd be back at your equilibrium. So when prices are greater than the equilibrium price, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and this creates a surplus in the market, causing the suppliers to reduce prices in order to sell those unsold goods or items. When your price is less than the equilibrium price, the demand is higher than the quantity being supplied. This causes a shortage in the market, and when there is a shortage in the market, people are willing to pay a higher price for those items, which causes the price of these goods to go up. And this graph basically depicts this behavior. If the price was $1.50, the demand would be 10, whereas the supply would be lesser, and this 6 items would be in. There will be a shortage of 6 ice creams. This would cause some people to be willing to pay a higher price, causing the price to increase and go back to $2. That would be the equilibrium. And this movement is basically the market at work. So there are a couple of steps involved in analyzing what happens in different markets due to different situations happening in the market. And in analyzing any scenario and deciding what happens in the market, what happens to the supply of the particular good in the market, or what happens to the price of the good in the market, you need to first figure out what is this factor affecting? What's it related to? Is it related with the supply curve or the demand curve? Then you need to figure out if this is income, for example, if this is input costs, then it's obviously related with supply. Then you need to decide whether this effect would cause the supply curve to move towards the left or the right. And then you have to show it on the same graph and figure out what happens to the price and quantity at equilibrium. So here's the case. We'll discuss um, this case. So for every kind of scenario that you're faced with, the first thing that you need to do is you come up with an individual starting position. In this case, we're talking about the ice creams again. We're discussing a scenario in which $2 is the equilibrium price at which seven ice creams are demanded and seven ice creams are being supplied in the economy. What happens to the equilibrium price of ice cream when there is an increase in demand for ice creams? So one of the reasons for an increase in demand in ice creams could be an increase in income. It could be an increase in wealth. It could be uh, increase in price of, say, substitute, which was frozen yogurt. But what's happening is the demand for ice cream is increasing. Let's suppose it's summertime. In summers, the demand for ice cream goes up. So the demand curve moves forward. When the demand curve moves forward, you have a new equilibrium price, a new equilibrium, quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So there is a new equilibrium, and at this new equilibrium, price levels have gone up because the demand has gone up. Please note over here that the supply curve has not increased, but the quantity supplied has increased. So on the x-axis, you have quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Although the supply curve didn't move left or right, the supply did not change, but the quantity supplied changed. Now, this is an important thing that most people have difficulty understanding. Make sure you understand that a shift in the curve depicts a shift in the supply. Movement along the curves depict a change in quantities supplied. So now what's happened is price levels have increased. Earlier, at the lower prices, the supplier was only willing and able to supply only seven of those ice creams. But once the price goes up, he's now able and willing to supply a higher amount of ice creams. Now he's supplying 10 ice creams at the new equilibrium point with the new equilibrium price. We'll discuss a couple of other scenarios as well. Um, so what happens when there is a decrease in supply? So we want to figure out what happens to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity when there is a decrease in supply. So recall we've discussed 3-4 reasons that affect supply. One of them was technology. The other was input costs. And the last one was technology. Let's suppose so it can be any of these cases. In this particular case, we are discussing an increase in input costs. So sugar has become more expensive. When sugar has become more expensive and you have a resource constraint, it causes the supply curve to move back. When the supply curve moves back, what happens is the equilibrium price increases. When the equilibrium price increases, there is a new equilibrium point over here at price 2.5. So you need to be able to visualize this in your mind. So if you've understood these, I'll go back to my graphs again and discuss this once more in a little bit more detail, and then we'll go on to the mathematical part of this uh, chapter. Right, so recall we've discussed that we were assuming a lot of things constant when we were discussing the demand law and saying that price and quantity were inversely related in the case of demand and directly related with in the case of supply. All these things assumed constant are factors that would impact the demand curve and cause the demand curve to shift. So I've listed them down over here for you guys. So income, if your income increases, the demand increases. If it goes down, demand decreases. If the price of an alternative good goes up, and if this alternative good is a substitute, you should expect that the demand of your good would, should increase, and vice versa. In the case of an alternative, if the price of an alternative, in the case of a complement, if the price of the complement goes up and its demand decreases, it should have a similar effect to your product, and the demand for your product will also decrease because both of your products, this product that you're talking about versus the complement, have to be used together. In the case of tastes, if your tastes or preferences change, it should cause a change in the demand as well. Expectations about incomes are going to impact the demand, of course, as well. If you expect that your uh, future income is going to be increasing, you might choose to demand more things now. If you expect that a big tax is going to be levied on you in the future, you might want to increase the demand now and consume now. If you have, if the number of buyers in the market increases, it should obviously cause the demand curve to move towards the right, and the demand should increase. For the case of supply, technology improvement should increase the supply of a particular commodity in the market. Price of input goods going up should cause the supply to decrease because the seller's resources are limited. If it falls, the seller should be able to supply more. Expectations that the price of a product are going to increase in the future should result in hoarding in the case of the supplier, and the supply should decrease in the market. And you should expect that when the prices increase, there will be an increase in supply in the market. Lastly, number of sellers has a direct relationship with the supplier. The more sellers you have, the more you can supply in the market. Now that we've talked about and listed down all of these different factors that impact supply and demand, um, we want to use these factors to actually figure out how equilibrium prices and quantities change when one of these factors changes in the economy. So I'll make a demand curve over here and a supply curve and show you the whole demand and supply model, and we'll discuss these different factors and how a change in one of these factors should impact the overall price and quantity of goods and services in the market. So we have a demand curve, the one that goes down is the demand curve, the one that goes up is the supply curve, and then we have a equilibrium price level, let's call it 10, and then we have an equilibrium quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Let's just use 10 over here as well. So this is the model that we're going to be using to analyze one of our problems. So uh, these problems can be a little tricky to understand. These problems can be a little tricky to understand, but if you keep in mind the factors that impact these demand and supply curves, you should be able to come up with an inference about what happens in the economy when, for example, say if this is the case of an ice cream, so if this was a case of ice creams and this was the demand curve of ice creams, the supply curve of ice creams, What do you think would happen if half of the factories that are producing ice cream in this particular economy got burned to the ground? Well, in that case, you should expect that since the sellers have gone down because of a lot of factories going burning down, the supply shouldn't decrease. A decrease in supply should cause the supply curve to move towards left, and when it moves towards the left, there is a new equilibrium point over here. Let's call it point P, and at this point P, what's happening is that price levels are increasing, and the quantities being supplied and the quantities being demanded falls because now the price has gone up as well. What's important to understand is that at point B, since the price has gone up, this is why the demand for ice creams at this particular price level is lower. Although you might notice over here that the demand curve has not shifted, which means the demand has not changed, but at this new particular price level, the quantity demanded is lesser because the price is higher, fewer people can afford to buy 10 ice creams at a price level of 10. If this all makes sense to you, I am going to be leaving you guys with a couple of scenarios that I want you to attempt for the next hour or so. Um, and these are problems that I want you to draw to solve on a piece of paper or and then take pictures of them and then send to me via email, or maybe you can just all right. So I'll share a few of these questions with you for you to solve, and you can solve them on a piece of paper and then send them to me via email, or you can just share your solutions on the WhatsApp group. So now comes the tricky part. So far, we've been focused on only making graphs, but we need to understand that all these graphs that we're making have or can be written in the form of equations as well. And this math is not going to be very tricky. So we'll discuss one particular case about how to solve for equilibrium quantities and equilibrium prices in this video, and later on in our video session we can go into more details regarding this. So before I start off with the actual maths over here, I just want to explain to you that when we talk about the demand and supply model, and we say that we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. Recall from our first class when we discussed graphs and we talked about how linear equations would be very important for this course. This is where linear equations come into play. What we need to understand is that these two graphs that we made, these two linear lines that we've drawn over here, they can be represented in the form of a mathematical equation as well. So for example, this demand curve over here could may be written in the form of in the following form. Price is equal to minus 3q plus 10. So let me just, so for example, the demand, the equation for this graph, this particular linear line could be written in the following form. Price is equal to minus 3 QD plus 10. Similarly, the supply curve over here will also have an equation behind it. So this graph has been drawn using a particular equation. So I'm just making these up. Price is equal to plus 4 quantity supplied plus 2. Understand over here that this minus sign is telling you that this is the gradient, it's downward sloping. The positive sign says it's going upwards, meaning the supply curve. If you have the equations of these two lines over here, you can use these equations to figure out what the equilibrium price of a particular good in the market would be, and what would be the equilibrium quantity being supplied in the market. Recall, equilibrium quantity was where uh, the market was clearing. No product was left behind unsold, right? So using these two equations over here, we want to now figure out what the equilibrium price in the market is and what the equilibrium quantity being supplied in the market is. Recall, equilibrium was the point where quantity demanded becomes, sorry, recall that equilibrium point was the point where quantity demanded becomes equal to the quantity supplied. So your quantity demanded becomes equal to the quantity supplied, and at this point, uh, the price that you get at this point is called the equilibrium price. But the condition for an equilibrium is that the quantity demanded becomes equal to the quantity supplied. Meaning that if these two equations were set as equal, you could find out the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. Without even going into any kind of economics, um, if you've studied this in your maths course, you'll find that since these two are linear equations, you can use these linear equations to actually find the value of P and Q just by substituting one equation in the other. So what I'll do over here is I'll just I'll just substitute one equation in the other by substituting this P with this P, and since this yellow P is it's this part, I can put it over here, and the equation I end up with is 4QS plus equal to minus 3QD plus 10. And since we've assumed that at equilibrium quant QD and QS are equal, so let's just call them Q. So what we've ended up with is 4Qs plus 2 is equal to minus 3Q plus 10. And if you solve this further, you find that 7Q is equal to 7Q 8 and Q is equal to 7 by 8. Once you have the value of Q, now you can do into either one of them and you can find out the value of, and that is how you the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. Since I just made these by myself, that's why we've come up with a 1 point something quantity. In the exam, you'll find out that the answer should give you a rather. I'll give you a couple of questions for practice as well in the exercise plan for you in today's class, so that you can practice this on your own time and how things work.